Hello and welcome to this video on section 3.1 fallacies in general. The rest of this class is pretty much going to be devoted to what are called the informal fallacies. And I think it's better to do them at the end because in order to understand what's informal about them, it is first required, or it's better if you understand what formal means. So hopefully by now we understand the idea of what formal means. I'll come back to the distinction between form and content in a little bit, but it is a distinction that we talked a lot about in section 6.1. So remember that there is a difference between form and content. And so let's talk about that in terms of fallacies right now. First of all, fallacies are mistakes in reasoning. That's what they are. So when someone commits a fallacy, they commit a mistake in reasoning. More specifically, they give a bad argument, a bad logical argument. So, with all the fallacies, there will always be a bad logical argument, which typically means that it's invalid, right? Because invalid is synonymous with bad. There are some that are inductive fallacies, and so those won't be invalid but weak, inductively weak, as we'll see later in section 3.3. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about formal fallacies. So again, remember, we do have this distinction between form and content, and we've been symbolizing or formalizing arguments. So by now you should understand, you should know what form means. Modus ponens is a valid form, right? We've already used it as a rule to deduce further premises when we did the proofs in sections 7.1 as well as 7.2. Here is that form: if P then Q, P therefore Q. So the question I want to raise now, is it possible to take modus ponens and somehow misuse it or misapply it such that someone makes a mistake in reasoning? Remember that modus ponens is valid. So if you have a premise which is of the form if P then Q, and then if you have P again, then Q necessarily follows. That's what it means for that to be valid. So modus ponens is valid. It works all the time. It never fails in terms of validity. You will always have a valid argument if as long as that argument obeys this form of if P then Q, P therefore Q. So is it possible for someone to misapply it, to misuse it? Let's look at an argument to see if we can answer that question. Here we have it. If apes are intelligent, then apes can solve puzzles. Apes can solve puzzles, therefore apes are intelligent. Okay, the question here is this modus ponens? If it is, then it will be valid, right? Because all arguments which are based off of the form modus ponens are valid. So what we have here is, the question is, do we have modus ponens? Do we have if P then Q, P therefore Q? Okay, well, let's symbolize the argument and then let's see if it has that form. On the left here, I have it symbolized. I represents apes are intelligent. S represents apes can solve puzzles. And then we basically would have the form here: if I then S, right? That would be the first premise, the first proposition. The second one would be apes can solve puzzles. That would be the S. And then the conclusion here is the I, right below the line, which is that apes are intelligent. Okay, so a closer look tells us that this is actually not modus ponens, right? Notice that what we actually have here is if P then Q, Q therefore P. Okay, this is a formal fallacy. And it's a formal fallacy because it's committed at the level of form. Somebody has misused modus ponens and they've made a formal fallacy. And so there are quite a lot of these formal fallacies. This one here in particular, by the way, the if P then Q, Q therefore P, is called affirming the consequent. Because what has happened there is the Q, which is the consequent, has been affirmed. And so that is a fallacy. That is a formal fallacy. There's a long list of formal fallacies. In this chapter, we're not going to look at formal fallacies. we're going to look at informal fallacies. But it's better to understand what a formal fallacy is, and hopefully this has helped you in understanding what that means. So, what are then informal fallacies? Okay, well, if formal fallacies are committed at the level of form, if they all have to do with some form like modus ponens or disjunctive syllogism, or any of the other forms, if they have to do with a misuse of those forms, then informal fallacies will not deal with form. That the in, remember, means not. So that another way of saying this is basically not formal fallacies or non-formal fallacies. So then that basically means that we have to go back to this distinction between form and content, right? And what we're dealing with here then has to be content, right? If the fallacies here are not committed at the level of form, it basically means that they're committed at the level of content. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, content here basically means language. These fallacies are not going to be committed because of form, but rather because of misuse of language. And so that could involve emphasis on certain words. It could involve making it appear through the manipulative use of language that an argument is good, but it really isn't, because none of the fallacies are good. It's going to depend on the specific fallacy, and that's why we just have to look at the kinds of informal fallacies, and then specific ones that fall under those kinds. So that's what informal fallacies means then. It means fallacies committed at the level of content. What we're talking here about is language, the manipulation of language to make you think that we have a good argument, but we don't. So the rest of this course is basically going to be dedicated to just going through them. In the next section 3.2, we're going to look at a specific type of informal fallacies, the fallacies of relevance.